On October 7, 2025, an Idaho Fish and Game Field technician climbed to a saddle below Fish Fin Ridge in the granite core of the Bighorn Crags and pulled the memory card from Grid Camera 14C, a standard passive infrared trail unit that had been running untouched for 90 days as part of the agency's summer elk and goat survey. 89 of those nights are unremarkable. Mule deer at dusk, a black bear passing through in late July, a mountain goat nanny and kid crossing at 12:58 a.m. on August 18th. The kind of routine capture the survey exists to collect. At 1:04 a.m., 6 minutes after that goat pair left the frame, the sensor started firing again, and it did not stop. But the card is only where this starts. That saddle sits inside the Frank Church River of No Return Wilderness, the largest unbroken roadless wilderness in the continental United States outside Alaska, close to 9,500 square kilometers of granite, timber, and river canyon, with no cell signal anywhere inside its boundary, and, in the case of the crags themselves, no published record of anyone crossing that terrain on foot in winter. Picture the saddle at that hour. No moon. The granite still holding the day's heat. Wind under 5 miles an hour by the unit's own log. The kind of stillness a person who has spent real nights at elevation learns not to trust for long. Between 1:04 and 1:52 a.m., the camera logged 316 separate triggers. Not continuous recording, 316 distinct detections, each one requiring the sensor to register a fresh burst of heat and motion after the previous frame had already reset and gone idle again. This was not the goat pair coming back through. Goats do not re-enter a detection zone 300 times inside 50 minutes. Nothing about that pattern matches feeding, bedding, or ordinary travel. It was not the bear from 3 weeks earlier either. An animal working a scent trail investigates a fixed point, and an investigating bear knocks a housing off its mount or claws at the security strap. Grid Camera 14C's mount never shifted a degree. A passing animal trips a passive infrared sensor once, or a handful of times if it lingers to graze. It does not trip it 316 times in under an hour, and it does not do it while leaving the ground beneath the unit, exactly as undisturbed as the technician found it 6 weeks later. Where that saddle sits matters as much as what the camera recorded there. The Frank Church River of No Return Wilderness was established by Congress in 1980 and took its current name 4 years later, in 1984, in honor of the Idaho senator who spent much of his career fighting to protect it. At 2,366.57 acres, it remains the largest contiguous federally managed wilderness in the country outside Alaska, jointly administered across 5 national forests with no permanent road crossing any part of it. The Bighorn Crags sit near the wilderness's eastern edge, a sub-range of granite spires and alpine lakes reached, at best, by 40 miles of primitive dirt road to a single trailhead campground. Locals in Salmon and Chalice simply call it the Crags. It doesn't have a folk name beyond the one already on the map, and it doesn't need one. Fish Fin Ridge itself climbs to 9,700 feet, a short distance from Grid Point 14C, first documented as climbed in 1955, and nothing about its access has gotten easier since. There is no single published number for how many people have gone into the crags and not come back out on schedule. Lemhi County doesn't keep a running public tally, and no state agency compiles one specific to this drainage. What the county's own record does hold is dated. On September 7, 1968, a 39-year-old bow hunter named Raymond Jones walked into the country near the East Fork of Hayden Creek not far from this same range and did not walk back out. He was declared legally dead in 1970. In the strict sense, his file has never closed. It would be easy to file the camera's 48 minutes as a known nuisance. Wind-loaded brush, an insect swarm working the lens, a sensor glitch shaken loose by cold. That explanation survives exactly as long as it takes to check the unit's own temperature log for that hour, which shows a steady 2-degree overnight drift consistent with a calm, clear night. Not the kind of gusting air that moves brush against rock with any regularity. It survives exactly as long as it takes to notice that the ground under the mounting tree at 9,200 feet still carries browse marks and hoof prints from the goat pair 6 minutes earlier, and shows nothing at all from whatever came through for the next 48. It would also be easy to assume a unit like this, sitting untouched for 3 months in some of the least accessible ground in the lower 48, could have simply been compromised after the fact, swapped, edited, uploaded remotely. Idaho Fish and Game's own survey protocol rules that out on its own terms. Grid Camera 14C is a standard, non-cellular passive infrared unit with no transmitter of any kind, the same class of hardware the state would formally require statewide the following spring when new restrictions barred cellular-enabled trail cameras from public land entirely. Whatever is on that card came off that card, on that mountain, with no signal to send it anywhere else. The wilderness itself, on paper, covers close to 9,500 square kilometers, an area within a few percent of the entire island of Puerto Rico, folded into central Idaho, with only a small fraction of it crossed by anything resembling a maintained trail. Understanding exactly what Grid Point 14C was, and how it came to sit on that saddle in the first place, matters before anything else about that card makes sense. It was one node in a much larger network. Idaho Fish and Game has spent the last several years replacing part of its traditional aerial elk counts with grids of trail cameras placed at randomized GPS coordinates across a study area and synchronized to fire on a fixed interval, in addition to any motion they detect. A method the department has already run in the St. Joe Drainage, the South Fork of the Clearwater, and Winter Range across eastern Idaho. Point 14C was this survey's northernmost station in the Bighorn Crags block, chosen by the same randomization process as every other point on the grid, mounted at 30 inches on a subalpine fir, cabled and locked exactly the way every other unit on the mountain is cabled and locked. By every account from the crew that placed it, that was an unremarkable deployment. Nothing about the saddle stood out on the walk-in. Nothing about the site flagged for a second look. The technician who hiked back up in October to retrieve the card had run this exact grid for 6 seasons and had pulled cards out of harder country than this without incident every single time before this one. The last ordinary frame on the card is the goat pair, time-stamped 12:58 a.m., August 18th. That is the final capture anyone reviewing the file could look at and understand immediately without a second thought. The discovery didn't happen on the mountain. It happened 3 weeks later at a desk in the district office when a junior biologist working through the season's backlog of memory cards reached Grid Point 14C. The first pass through the folder looked like corruption. Hundreds of near-identical frames stacked into a single folder usually means a failing sensor. It wasn't until someone opened the frames in sequence, one at a time, that the pattern stopped looking like a malfunction and started looking like something else. What the technical review team eventually cataloged from that saddle amounted to an evidence list in its own right. The security cable was still cinched at the same torque it had been set to on deployment day, with no scoring or slip marks anywhere along its length. The housing's latch was still sealed and dry inside, no moisture intrusion, no sign it had ever been opened in the field. The duff beneath the fur carried a clean, legible browse trail and 2 sets of hoof prints from the goat pair at 12:58, and beneath that same tree for the following 48 minutes, nothing. No print, no disturbed needle litter, no scat. Nothing a large animal moving through repeatedly for the better part of an hour would fail to leave behind. The battery pack, 8 lithium cells, rated for roughly this exact deployment length, was reading lower than the flash count alone should have drawn it down, as if something had kept pulling current even between visible triggers. And the unit's internal clock, cross-checked against the grid's master GPS sync, had not drifted by so much as a second across all 90 days, before, during, or after the 48 minutes in question. And cases like this one, files that come back from routine survey equipment carrying something nobody on the team ordered up, surface out of Idaho's backcountry camera program more often than most people watching this would expect. Subscribing with notifications on is the only way to know when the next one gets reviewed and released. Now, back to that saddle. There is one more detail in the review file worth stating plainly, because it's the reason this went further than a single technician's desk. Laid end to end, the 316 triggers are not evenly spaced. Between trigger 211 and 212, the gap drops to under 1 second, less than a third of the average gap across the rest of the sequence, meaning whatever tripped the sensor at that exact point was close enough, and already in motion fast enough, that the unit's own return to idle timer never had time to fully reset before firing again. No search followed because nothing at grid point 14C had gone missing. What followed instead was a second visit, 6 days after the card was first reviewed, when 2 technicians hiked back to the saddle with a replacement unit and checked the 4 nearest grid points on the same randomized layout. The closest just under 2 kilometers away, across a drainage, with no direct line of sight to 14C. None of those 4 cameras recorded anything unusual on the night of August 18th. Whatever moved through that one detection zone for 48 minutes appears, on the record the department currently has, to have stayed inside it. The department's own read on the file, once it moved above the district level, came back measured and unembellished. The leading internal theory attributes the sequence to wind-loaded understory brush swinging against sun-warmed granite, a known source of false triggers at exposed elevation, compounded by a possible partial sensor fault that later diagnostic checks on the unit did not reproduce. No malfunction was confirmed, no cause was ruled definitive. The file was flagged, archived, and, as of this writing, left open, which, inside a state biology department, is its own kind of ruling. That explanation accounts for some of what's on the card. It does not account for all of it. Wind-loaded brush produces an irregular scatter of triggers, not 316 sustained, unbroken detections across 48 consecutive minutes. It does not explain a temperature log showing calm, steady overnight conditions for the exact window in question. It does not explain undisturbed duff beneath the mount, an intact security cable, or a battery draw that outpaces the visible flash count. The theory explains why nobody photographed anything standing upright at the edge of the frame. It does not explain the sub-second gap between trigger 211 and 212. One point about this file requires complete transparency, stated exactly where it belongs, and not folded into a footnote later. Since the review became known within the small circle of technicians who work this grid, an account has circulated among some of them, never entered into any official incident report, never confirmed by the department in any public statement, that a separate camera on a different survey block in the Craigs logged a comparable trigger cluster 2 seasons earlier, and that the card from that unit was quietly pulled from the study data and never formally logged. That account has never been officially confirmed anywhere. It is second-hand, uncorroborated, and it deserves to be weighed exactly that way, as something people who work this ground say to each other, not as documented fact. Attached to almost any other patch of Idaho backcountry, an account like that would likely go nowhere. But the Bighorn Crags already carry a reputation before anyone adds a rumor to it, a range with no published record of winter travel, reached by 40 miles of dirt road, sitting inside a county whose own files still hold a name from 1968 that was never fully closed. Raymond Jones spent decades hunting that country before the fall he didn't come home from. He wasn't visiting for the first time with rented gear and a trail app. He was a working bow hunter who knew the East Fork of Hayden Creek drainage as well as almost anyone alive at the time. More than 70 people, a search dog and a helicopter, searched for him in the fall of 1968. Snow ended the search before it found him. He was declared legally dead in 1970, with no cause of death entered, because there was nothing yet to examine. That status held for 53 years. In September of 2021, another hunter working the same general country found his remains and reported them to the Lemhi County Sheriff's Office. What exactly those remains could and couldn't tell investigators was never made public in detail, and it isn't the part of this file that matters here. What matters is that even with modern forensic recovery methods, more than half a century later, investigators could not determine how he died. The file that closed in 2021 states almost exactly what the file that opened in 1968 stated: cause of death, undetermined. Some places don't generate more open files, they just take longer to close the ones they already have. Whether that pattern reaches beyond this one drainage isn't something this file can answer, and this account won't claim otherwise. What the file can say is narrower and better supported. Grid point 14C sits inside a range that already carried a name and a 57-year-old open case before anyone climbed up to pull this particular card. False triggers themselves are nothing rare in camera trap wildlife science. Insects crossing the lens, heat shimmer off warm rock, wind working dry brush, all well documented, all boring. None of those categories, on their own or combined, are known to produce a sustained 50-minute run of 316 detections with a sub-second gap buried inside it. That isn't a claim about what did move through grid point 14C. It's a statement about what an ordinary false trigger looks like, and this isn't that. Nothing that follows is established as fact. It is the only sequence of movement the physical record from that saddle actually permits, and no more than that. Picture the saddle at 1:04 in the morning, granite still faintly warm under a clear, windless sky. Something enters the edge of the detection zone and doesn't cross it in a straight line the way a deer or goat crosses ground it isn't interested in. It works the perimeter instead, in, out, in again, never fully leaving the zone long enough for the sensor's return to idle timer to complete a full reset, never committing to the center of the frame where the unit's resolution is sharpest. For 48 minutes, whatever it is stays at the edges, moving the way something moves when it already understands exactly where a camera's field of view begins and ends. The facts don't move once the theory is set aside. 316 triggers in 48 minutes. A sub-second gap between two of them that the sensor's own hardware shouldn't be able to produce from two unrelated events. Undisturbed ground beneath a mount with an intact cable and a sealed housing. A temperature log that rules out the department's own leading explanation. None of it matches the wind-loaded brush theory currently sitting in the file, and none of it has been reconciled by anyone willing to put their name on a different one. This channel does not resolve that file, and it will not pretend to. What the record shows is what the record shows, and where the record stops, this account stops with it. Files like this one, closed on paper, open in every way that matters, surface out of backcountry archives like Idaho's more often than most people expect, and most of them start the same way this one did, as somebody's routine data, flagged by somebody paying close attention. If you know of a case that belongs in this archive, the comments are usually where it starts. Grid point 14C is back in the field, running again, mounted on the same subalpine fur, 30 inches up, cabled the same way it always has been. The card comes out again in 90 days.